And now I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on building your future with Server 2016. I'm going to hand things over to our Microsoft Product Manager, David Mulkey.
Good morning. It's fantastic to be here with all of you today during our Microsoft Product Focus Month. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. We're going to have an in-depth discussion about building your future with Server 2016. We're hosting several webinars over the month of March, covering some of the most popular topics from Microsoft. So please check out our website to see our past webinars or to register for any of our future webinars. So digital transformation is top of mind for every organization, and all of that starts with the infrastructure. So joining us today is Jamie Rodriguez to walk us through some of the ways you can build your future with Server 2016. Jamie started in the technology field as an information systems manager in 1992 and has since worked in customer engagement design and implementation. So he brings a lot of real world experience to you today. He's also been one of our top tier instructors with New Horizons since 2009. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jamie Rodriguez. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here with us. We're going to take 30, 45, maybe an hour, depending on how much Q&A we have at the end and how interested y'all might be in some of the topics we're going to discuss here, and really just cover certainly some of the things involved in Server 2016, but also make sure that we've got a good foundational understanding of how we've evolved and some of the more significant changes to the platform and to the product. And so in going through, I'll mix in a combination for you of certainly some PowerPoints to guide us along, but also want to expose you to some ways that we try to deliver content and some of the tools that we have to make the training that we do and to make the knowledge transfer that we do for you just as seamless and as easy for you to follow as possible. So we'll do a little bit of real time, we'll do some external links, we'll do a little bit of drawing and doodling, and just again take some time to highlight some of the technologies and some of the features here available in Server 2016. So the first thing that we're going to do, or from a list perspective, we'll talk a little bit about some of the changes to our installation options. So certainly the base install option. We'll talk a little about Server Core. We'll talk a little bit about Nano and what that's changed and what that really means. Take some time to describe those things for anybody who might not be familiar with them. Then we'll focus a little bit on Hyper-V. Again, take some time to, discuss virtualization and make sure that we all got a good foundational understanding of virtualization generally, how we got here, some of the things that we used to be able to do, and some of the things that we've evolved to now with Server 2016 from a virtualization standpoint. From there, we'll go into clustering. Again, try to give everybody just a good solid feel for clustering in general. Then we'll focus a little bit more on some of the new features that Server 2016 brings to the table for us in regards to clustering. From there, we'll do PowerShell, really brief on PowerShell. There's not a ton we'll add here, but we'll talk about the fact that we've extended a bunch of PowerShell commandlets to support some of the new features that we'll look at. And those of you who are familiar with PowerShell, obviously you've got a good feel for commandlets and syntax and structure. If you're not familiar with PowerShell and what it brings, we'll take a little bit of time to go through that as well. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a nice overview of some of the storage technologies that have been implemented and certainly enhanced and improved in moving forward a little bit into what we have to to cover. As we go through this, we try to really handle this more in a lecture discussion demo format for you. So we don't really integrate any Q&A directly during the session, but if you're taking notes or if you have little questions or things that you'd like to reach out and discuss post our conversation here, as Kelly mentioned at the beginning, I'm certainly available to spend time with you afterwards to go over anything that you might be curious about once we've wrapped this up. So the first thing that we're going to look at here is a little bit on server config. And if we kind of go back to what we had moving forward from like a server 2003 to 2008 to 2012, and obviously now into 2016, we've had a common set of tools that all of us are used to generally working in. And that tool involved, or those tools involved, a standard or a consistent GUI that allowed us to do the things that we needed to do, right? And so Microsoft started to evolve that out a little bit to get to a point where we were able to run the core functionality and the core features that we needed without necessarily having to maintain and run the GUI. So when this first came out and you started to see this, we started to see basic components of it in 2003. We moved along a little bit into more of what they called a core installation in 2008, and have enhanced it moving forward. The idea was really to provide two things, right? To be able to go in and to say, hey, we don't want to dedicate resources to providing a GUI, because a lot of times, once the box is set up, we're not really in that GUI a whole lot. If we're going to be running IIS for web services, we go ahead, we spin up IIS, we go through the config on it, we maybe drop things into a load balanced array to host our websites, but then generally from there we're really working within the website. We're working with the specific IIS piece. I don't necessarily need to have access to everything else for within the GUI that it provides, right? So again, there's resources that could be better used, making sure the website's available, making sure that we've got access to the things we need to access from within that interface, instead of on the back end providing access to a GUI that nobody's really using anyway. So what they started to do is they started to take away the GUI interface. The second thing that would do is to really begin to minimize the platform for any sort of security related intrusion, right? Because if we're going to start locking this down to where we've got really just a minimal core OS running without support for any type of the native GUI components or potential targets for hackers to get into, well, we're minimizing that as well the minute that the GUI goes away. So it wasn't that you couldn't go in and that we couldn't enable and activate IIS. It wasn't that we couldn't go in and enable and activate DNS as a service. It's just that we got rid of the GUI that sits on top of it. And so the implementation of that, getting away from the standard desktop experience and the standard management tools, was Server Core. And again, what Server Core did was to remove that graphical interface for the reasons, and obviously looking into the benefits that were then at that point available via Core. So from an administrative standpoint, now your next question really is, all right, well, look, if I can't go into the GUI and I can't do the things I want to do in the GUI, how are we going to get the work that we need to get done? And so what they started to open up in Core were options. PowerShell remoting, right? The ability to connect remotely and leverage and utilize essentially what was a command line driven set of tools and interfaces to do the configuration. And then for those of us who might be a little bit, let's see, how could we put this? A little bit command line challenged or PowerShell challenged, they still provided the tools to go in and to potentially remote into the box and to provide an MMC based component to it. So if we're running an instance of Server Core, we could go in and we could enable RDP. We could still RDP into it and then have an MMC that would load the plugin for IIS, right? Or an MMC that would load the plugin for managing DNS on the box, without again necessarily having to provide full access to all of the other GUI components. And certainly, right, a very, very popular implementation. You kind of started to see it as a headless implementation of sorts that that was provided. And so now what we see, and moving forward a little bit with Server 2016, was the implementation of what Microsoft defined as Nano Server. And so Nano Server took the operating system environment that was available in Core and started the process of shrinking it down. If you go in and kind of look at some of the white papers and some of the technical details, from just an OS load perspective, they'll tell you that Nano Server consumes about a 20th of the resources that native Windows Server Core consumed. So they took away at that point everything that you could natively run in server core other than support for applications. And by applications, we really mean web apps. By web apps, we mean IS-related components and anything you might need to do to essentially run mobile apps, websites, anything else that might be developed. So they really stripped it down. And simply put, what this means is that, if we were going in and we were looking at something like a server core install or a server core instance, listen, we still had in server core the ability to run Hyper-V. So we could still spin up virtual machines in the core environment, even though we didn't have a GUI running. We could still go out and we could set up clustering with server core boxes to still support clustering functionality and failover between the virtual machines, even though we didn't have the GUI. We could do the same thing for storage. We could do the same thing for DNS. So when they moved to Nano, now what we saw was those things went away. When we're running an instance of Nano server, you can't go in and install Hyper-V. You can't go in and install DNS. You can't go in and install clustering. There are no advanced storage components to it. It's basically a really stripped down web server of sorts. So we're optimizing it, and by we, I mean Microsoft. They didn't call me on this, but I'll throw myself in there anyway. What's been done is they took it and they stripped it down, so you're really just running .NET apps. And again, by .NET apps, what we're talking about is mobile application development, services that are needed, along with integration for obviously support for IIS, any of the related .NET components that need to be added, and certainly website and web service functionality. So what you could initially do with it was you had an option to go out and you could install Server 2016 in one of those three. We could go and do an install and we'd say, hey, let's just do a standard server with desktop experience. Let's do a standard server with server core, or let's go ahead and just drop an instance of Nano on it. Now, that's since been changed. The only way now that we're going to be able to run an instance of Nano is from within a virtual container. And we'll talk about containers here in just a bit and discuss some of the functional advantages that they provide as well. So, again, going through, because Nano Server now has been relegated to just container-based install, if we just went in and we're going to do the standard install, your two choices are going to be standard and data center. And then, as we note here in the slides, you got to be careful when you go in and just select the standard option, because what standard really means is core, or when you select the data center option, because data center on its own really means is core. So you could drop a standard, you could drop a data center, and then at that point you have the core installation, and then it's up to you to go back in and define administrative tools that you want to use, whether you're going to be someone who's a little more comfortable in the PowerShell environment to enable functionality in core, or whether you're somebody who wanted to have more of a GUI-based kind of an RDP utilizing MMCs, then you'd have to add the remote desktop components to your core install to give you that functionality. And then, certainly, again, if we're just going to go the regular installation, the desktop experience there is going to provide that, for us. Now things that we don't get into in here, but generally folks are at least a little bit familiar with, the standard and the data center installation options generally are not going to be driven around products or things that we'll support. In other words, I can still install Hyper-V in a standard installation just like I can install Hyper-V in a data center installation. Generally, where the differences between the standard and the data center come in, it has to do with hardware. How much memory are we going to be able to put in the box? How many processors are going to be supported? Those are the sorts of things that that we're really looking at when we make that standard or data center selection. And again, at some point, if you dig a little bit deeper, we take the time to go in and really look at the functional aspects and the differences between those two products. All right, so we had mentioned just a moment ago that the only spot now that Nano objects will be created are going to be in things called containers. So when we look at containers, or when you hear containers, there's a lot of stuff out there that does a pretty good job of complicating what can be, in some ways, a relatively simple topic. What Microsoft has done, and this actually came from originally kind of a Linux-based kernel and application, and as Microsoft is known to do, right, they find things out there and they leverage and fix and hopefully make better for us in the Windows environment. And I think containers certainly is one of those. So when we look at the way that applications are managed, and we look at the ways that servers have evolved and are being managed now, we've got a pretty straight path to where we are. Back in the day, if you go back 2000, 2003, a lot of what we were used to working on were physical boxes, right? If I wanted to go out and I wanted to do something, then we'd take this, we'd install the operating system on the box, we get it all configured and set up, and then you had a physical machine that you would go in and do whatever you needed to do on. Well, as we got into Server 2008, we began to see for the first time this big push towards virtualization. And the advantage that virtualization provides us with is that instead of having to dedicate multiple servers, multiple physical boxes to run the things we need to run, we have the ability to use a single physical box and to create virtual instances. And each one of those virtual instances will have its own operating system, its own configuration, network, disk space, etc., in the form of what's defined as a VHD or a virtual disk. So here what you're seeing right now, right? What I've got for you here is essentially a domain controller that's running our PowerPoints. I've got another box here. This is actually an operations manager box that I use for some other things that we do. But this is running here kind of an instance of a virtual lab environment, so we can talk a little bit about Hyper-V. And then over here we've got another box that I'm using just for some reference documentation and things that can add a little bit of depth to the topic we're discussing, right? Got another box here, got another box here, got another box here, running System Center Service Manager, got another box here running Orchestrator. So if you count them with me, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 machines. And again, if we go back to part of virtualization, that means that I've got to have 7 physical boxes to run the things that I need to run. So now with the advent of some of the virtualization technologies that we're discussing, instead of going out and having to run those 7 boxes, utilizing Microsoft's virtualization tools or potentially third-party tools like VMware, now what I can do is I can simply go about taking my physical host and I can start the process of creating and installing operating systems and virtual machines. So let's think about the advantage here in regards to virtualization. If we're looking at this, the box that I've got, the physical machine right now, we look at it together, you can see I've got 64 gig in it, and I've got a couple of dual core processors. So being able to virtualize, I can take that 64 gig and I can take those quad core processors, and you and I have the ability to create virtual machines, and within each virtual machine, we can basically slice up the available hardware and dedicate it to the virtual machines that we're using. So now we can say this virtual machine is going to have a maximum of 6 gig of memory. And by the way, I know that I've got 4 virtual cores or 4 cores on this machine. I'm going to let this box utilize 2 cores of the 4 cores processor-wise that I have. By also dedicating and creating a virtual hard drive, I'm creating essentially a virtual instance of the operating system, disk space, things of that nature for this box. Also able to go in and to assign it access to either an internal network to allow the virtual machines to talk directly to each other, and I also have the ability to dedicate an external network to give them access to the internet should they need. So virtualization is all about, at least in the context of what we're seeing right now, is about sharing physical resources, right? I've got one host that I've gone ahead and pumped up So I've got enough memory and the processor that I think I need, the horsepower I think I need, and then I'm simply leveraging that to assign resources to the virtual machines internally that are running. So what y'all are really seeing right now is this RDP console is essentially connected to all of the virtual machines that are currently running, right? There's a SharePoint box, here's a SQL box, here's a domain controller. This interface is connecting straight to those boxes. So again, it's the hardware that we're sharing. So let's go a little farther now, right? Because what this means is that if I was running something on, in our case, London, we'll say AP1, and I'd installed an app on it. So I install the app, and then I want to go ahead and I want to be able to easily reconfigure or easily reinstall or re-enable the application or the settings that I had enabled and added in this virtual machine. How am I going to have to do that? Well, the only way to do it pre-containers is to take the entire virtual machine and to go about the process of exporting it. And after I exported the entire virtual machine, then I would have to re-import it to another host, spin it up, and I'd have the ability to go in and work with the application as it was in the original box that I exported. The problem with that, almost like a full backup of sorts, is that the virtual machine files are huge. So by the time you start installing things in here, you've got differencing files to keep an eye on things that have changed. You might be looking at 10, 20, 30, 40 gig of VHD virtual machine that we've got to export out so we can put somewhere else. It's not quick. It's not easy. So the reality is that all I really needed was that application. I didn't necessarily need the whole machine. So here's the, kind of our evolution, right? The physical host right there, which again, we would have had 7 of if we wanted to install all those things. Then when we got to virtualization, we had now multiple instances here of the virtual machines. So each one of these now are virtual machines that are running like we just saw. And then we said, we're going to go ahead and drop an application on that virtual machine. So our goal now is to be able to access that app, to be able to potentially work with the application on or in a different physical box. So if I'm a website dev or I'm an application dev, and I've got that app that's running, and I need to quickly be able to get that application loaded and running on a different host, in the event that something went wrong with host 1 here, what did I have to do? I can't just export the app. I can't just export the application and its settings. I've got to export the entire virtual machine, and by exporting out the entire virtual machine, then at that point I've got the application. Then I got to import the virtual machine to fire up the app. Again, not quick, not easy. So with containers now, what Microsoft has done, and whether it's a physical container, so we got a virtual machine running and an app within, or whether it's going to be just an app that we've installed directly on the host, our containers are going to be supported. So here's what we need. We'd first have to have another virtual machine over here on host 2. And the 2 virtual machines, so this virtual machine and this virtual machine, would all need to be running the same thing. So we'd set this up. This might be running server 2012 R2 on a server 2016 host. This one would have to be doing the same thing over here, 2012 R2. And remember, our goal is to be able to efficiently recreate the environment that the application needs to run. So instead of having to export out the entire thing, with a container, we're bundling and packaging the libraries, the components that the application needs. We're not taking the entire server, the entire OS, the entire deployment and installation of IS. All we're really taking is what, in a sense, is a virtualized instance of the application, any registry changes that the application might have made, any specific libraries, DLLs or otherwise, that might have been installed, and we're putting those all into a box, a container. Now, when it's time for us to need to go about taking this app and having it run on a different virtual machine or a different physical machine, instead of having to take the entire VM and all of the application settings and all of the OS settings and all of the IIS config, now we're just taking the container. So you take this thing, you export the container out, and then we can import the container that contains that application and its config settings over here. So just with a little bit of discussion and a little bit of walking through that, what would y'all think some of the requirements would be? If we're going to use containers, what would the requirements for this to work be? Well, obviously the hosts, right? If the container and the app were dependent on IS, well, we'd have to make sure that IS was configured the same over here on both these boxes, right? If the operating system that the application needed was Server 2012 R2, we'd have to make sure that the operating systems on both hosts were going to be Server 2012 R2. So one of the nice things that kind of leads us to, and we'll talk about a little bit later, is that Microsoft's got tools that revolve around things called desired configuration. And so when we create a desired configuration template, the desired configuration template could be assigned to either the virtual machines or the physical hosts. And what the DCM template says is this: when we have configuration that is IIS with this and this and this enabled, any place we assign the template to will automatically go out and make sure that IIS is configured with this and this and this. Almost like a group policy of sorts, but more of a server level specific config. So doing that, now if we needed to modify configuration on all hosts that we had that had the ability to support containers for application 1, 2, 3, we would modify the template that we had assigned to each one of the hosts. That template would obviously have the new settings, that those settings would automatically be applied to the machines. Again, you think about that, the only other way to get that done prior to something like being able to use DCM, prior to being able to use containers, would be for us to manually go about taking each one of the configurations and applying it, right? Logging onto the box, setting the parameters, or potentially trying to automate via script. So a container at its simplest is a virtualized instance of the application, registry changes, libraries that are needed, everything that I need to run that box on that application on another machine. The underlying dependencies would be that the machine that I'm going to run it on obviously has to be configured to support the things that the container and the application within are going to be using. So advantage here, right? If you had to go with one word, if tonight, like when you're finished with whatever you're doing at work, at the office, or maybe Friday, right? So Friday, when you wrap things up at the end of the week, and you go to that party, and you're at that party, and somebody says, "Hey, what's the advantage of containers?" Or maybe those are just the parties I go to. Sad but true. Anyway, what you could say to them is that really the significant advantage to containers is our ability to easily transport applications from one environment to another. Right? At the end of the day, that's going to be one of the more significant things you could do with it, right? And so if you can say that, then you're going to be like, the most popular person at the party. It's great. So the way that you can ship, by the way, we'll talk about this a little bit later on as well. But the way that you have to take the containers and to ship them out from one spot to another is what Microsoft defines as Docker. So Docker really is kind of the OS level component that provides support for containers and that allows us to go in and export the containers and then re-import the containers in different environments. From an advantage standpoint, remember, right, you're isolating the application, its libraries. It gives us the ability to go back in and obviously easily restart, port application settings from one deployment to another, without the need to go out and to essentially, at this point, now export the entire VM. So look at the last button there, or excuse me, at the last bullet point. Containers are the only spot now where you can create or you can install an instance of Nano. So, I mean, again, going just a little bit farther into this thing, this kind of takes it to the next level, because now what we're saying is I don't necessarily even have to have a web service or a web component running on the box, because if we create the container, so now you've got the container that we've created, and we'll go one more. Now within the container, because Microsoft supports the ability to install an instance of Server 2016 Nano there, so now you've got a virtual OS running within a container. And remember that now Nano really only supports application-specific components. So now you install the app into the instance of Nano, and from a portability standpoint, again, web services, mobile, website support. Now, all I'm really doing is making sure that the two hosts are configured correctly, and that container can be easily replicated and duplicated from one to another. Right? I don't even have to have an instance of IIS running on the boxes to support the container functionality, because the application settings, IIS and otherwise, are now really virtualized from within Nano. Really, really neat way to lock down. And certainly the advantage here, high-end web service environments, external website and service providers, really makes it easy for us to duplicate configuration, to go about having a consistent deployment for mobile apps. That's primarily where I've seen it done lately, and obviously to some degree web services and things that go along with that as well. So just nice to get a feel for the evolution, right? I mean, where we've gone, or excuse me, where we came from, and what we're now providing support for. So Microsoft has stepped up, in every aspect here, from physical support at the hardware level to virtual support to coming in now and really giving us the ability to isolate applications to the nth degree with containers. They've really done a good job of building the server environment to support all of the latest technologies, tools, and functionality that we need. So, again, we talked a little bit about Hyper-V. So, whether you're doing a container at the operating system level. So again, the core OS, we could come in, we could take this, and we could say that we wanted to add a container to the physical machine running Server 2016. Or within a virtual environment, the virtual environment for Server 2016 also supports, again, container virtualization at that level too. So kind of interesting. And again, at the end of the day, it's prepackaged apps, prepackaged libraries, all of those things bundled into a neat little box or container so that we can easily export it, work on it, back it up, right, whatever it might be that we're doing across multiple platforms. So we touched a little bit on Hyper-V, and we talked about what Hyper-V gives us in regards to virtualization. And so what we've continued to do, what Microsoft has continued to do, is to try to improve the functionality that's available. That's available in regards to supporting and managing virtual machines. And so they continue to try to improve support for the physical hosts, and obviously the guests being the virtual machines that are running on those hosts. Just to give you kind of a brief overview of some of the things here that have been done, we now have the ability to go in and to support something called PowerShell Direct. And PowerShell Direct essentially means on a Server 2016 box that has virtual machines, you have the ability to go in and to initiate a remote PowerShell session directly to the virtual machine without necessarily having to go about and having a network connection defined. So in other words, right now I'm running on this box Server 2012 R2. So if I wanted to open up an instance of PowerShell and I wanted to run some sort of a remote command or manage a virtual machine remotely, I can't do it without first having an open network connection to the box that I can get to from the host. I have to loop into it, kind of like I'm doing for virtual machines. So with PowerShell Direct, we could disable. So I could go in and I could have an external network that the host didn't have access to, or I could have a network that only the virtual machines were able to see, and then use PowerShell to go in and still connect to the VMs running on the host to do administrative scripting, to do backup, restore, whatever calls I might need, again, without having to go about the process of trying to open up a network connection to the VM. Kind of neat, right? Certainly for folks who do a lot of VM administration, who do a lot of PowerShell scripts that you need to run, that sort of thing. It just gives you some flexibility on being able to remotely connect and to manage VMs without the need to, again, dedicate a network connection to doing that. Some other things that we've improved, we got things now called production checkpoints. And your production checkpoints allow us to leverage and utilize VSS within the virtual machine to create point-in-time snapshots that are essentially just deltas. So again, if you're familiar with Hyper-V, I could come in right now and I could create just a standard checkpoint, kind of like I've done right here. So this, if I apply the checkpoint, this thing's going to roll me back all the way to my initial config. The problem with this checkpoint is that it's an entire bundle, operating system, configuration, it's everything. I don't have the ability to go in to the virtual machine and say, I would like to create a snap for the difference right before this application installed and after this application installed, but I don't want everything else. I don't want to have to create a snap that, this thing's probably going to be like 8 gig because it's a differencing file for everything on the box. It's not just looking at deltas and things that have changed. So now what they've given us is the ability to say, all right, well, instead of creating just a traditional snap that we might do, let's go ahead and do a production checkpoint. And the production checkpoint is going to take the snap of the VM at that point without going in and creating the entire differencing disk that goes along with it. So simply put, the snap's going to be much smaller. We could create multiple production snaps for just different spots where things change. Hey, we've got a machine that we're going to use for testing Windows updates. So before we deploy Windows Update, let's go ahead and do a production checkpoint. And so then we have a snap of the machine before we apply the update. Then after we apply the update, we verify everything works. If the update broke something, then we can take it and we can apply the production checkpoint. Again, it's a much smaller file, and it's really only tracking deltas at that point instead of having to go in and get the entire thing. Again, just a little bit of enhanced functionality that we see there. The next thing we discuss within Server 2016 is nested virtualization. This right here is, I'm trying to think of a better word, but the only word that's coming to mind right now is, it's actually two words, but super cool. So really, really, really neat. Because what this does is it allows us to run a virtual machine within a virtual machine. And think about that for a sec. What that would mean is that right now I've got London DC1 this is a virtual machine, right? It's running. London DC1 is a virtual machine. I can't, with Server 2012, I can't go into this thing, install Hyper-V on it, and then try to open up another virtual machine on the London DC1 virtual machine. Won't let me do it. Okay? Now, with Server 2016, we actually have the ability to do that. With Server 2016, we could have a virtual machine running, and then within the virtual machine, enable Hyper-V and add another instance of a virtual machine. So just from a kind of a purely, how does this affect me and what I do? Well, look, when I try to go out and I try to maybe teach classes for virtualization, or I'm tasked with going in and talking about it, I've always been limited to having to stand up a physical box to do it, right? Because the only way that I can really discuss with you Hyper-V right now and virtualization is by having a physical machine to do it. Where now Server 2016 allows me to go in and say, all right, well, I'm going to go ahead and just create one virtual machine that I'll use for training. And then when I want to go out and discuss some of the Hyper-V components and the Hyper-V settings, then I've got the ability to go back in and to just add multiple instances of VMs within that Server 2016 VM. They define that as nested virtualization. I define that as IT magic, and really, really, really cool. So again, just gives us more and more flexibility on how we're able to isolate operating systems, isolate applications, and some of the things that are going to be available there as well. Just quick note, as far as portability goes, those of us running Server 2012 R2 and VMs, if we're looking for some of the latest or newer Server 2016 functionality, you do have the ability either through upgrade or through export of virtual machines. When you get over to the 2016 environment, you can natively update your existing virtual machine, so you don't have to recreate it. It is a manual process, but when you do manually update, what will happen is that the new Hyper-V Server 2016 functionality will be added to your old Server 2012 R2 VMs. And it is R2 specific. So what Microsoft recommends, if you run Server 2012, you go Server 2012 R2, and then you can bump up to Server 2016, pull all your virtual machines over, and go ahead and enable the Server 2016 functionality that will provide for you. So moving forward, we've got just a couple more minutes here. A brief overview on some of the clustering components that are available. I won't take a ton of time here. I think the thing to really consider is that we're going to have full support for all previous clustering functionality. So whether we decide to do a iSCSI based cluster, whether we're going to do native clustering, physical hosts with shared storage, you're going to have the option to go back in and obviously continue to support through incremental log shipping and synchronization of data, the ability to provide common access to a single endpoint. And you're thinking, what in the world does that all mean? Well, again, we'll make it easy, right? Traditional clusters, server, and then you had to have essentially what became an external storage cabinet. So, all the data was being kept right back here on this file server somewhere, the storage cabinet. And then, these were the two hosts that we had, host one, I'll try that one more time, host two. And the goal here was to make sure that, access to this back here was always available. So generally clustering was a standby and online. Basically, all traffic and all access to data would always come through server 1. In the event that server 1 was no longer available, we had a cluster heartbeat. So that cluster heartbeat would pass between the two. And I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, man, Jamie, you are really, really awesome at paint. I know. I get that a lot. But I digress. Anyway, so look, the heartbeat between the two boxes here is basically looking for connectivity between them. Is this box still up? So assuming we lost server 1, what the cluster services would natively do would be to check the heartbeat. Server 2 would say, hey, server 1's no longer there, and then we initialize a switchover event. The switchover event would take traffic and would start routing the traffic through server 2, obviously the common data source being back here in that external storage. And so traditionally, we were going to use SCSI cables to connect, or we were going to go with fiber channel. So we were spending a ton of money on SCSI or fiber, and then you had to have the back-end hardware to do it. Well, what Microsoft started to evolve to, starting in Server 2012 and then dramatically now improved in Server 2016, is the ability to go back in and to use iSCSI. So instead of having to go out and to say, hey, we're going to spend a bunch of money on dedicated fiber channel controllers, dedicated fiber channel hosts that we're using, and storage cabinets in the back, we can just use regular old Cat5. So we upgrade Cat5, or we upgrade the network cards. Go gig, go 10 gig, whatever you might be using across the board now. Now we can just use a dedicated iSCSI connection, common network cards, common cabling, and give the back-end storage components the access that we need here. So they've continued to evolve that. And one of the more significant things you'll see is in the ability to stretch clusters across multi-domain environments, across multiple subnets. The support obviously for iSCSI is huge because it gives us the ability to have one cluster endpoint separated from another cluster endpoint and just use traditional network connections to manage the heartbeat and the failover. The other thing that they continue to improve are the storage components. And obviously the clustering and making sure that the front end servers and the services they're running are available is one part of it. The second, the significant part is the back end, because at the end of the day, the boxes here and the services that we're running are just providing access to the data we need, that shared storage. So we have to make sure that the shared storage is also secured and available as well. So one of the more significant enhancements to clustering beyond this is now the ability to go in and to also leverage and utilize Azure storage. Now, those of you who are not familiar with Azure, if you're working with AWS, obviously Azure is Microsoft's AWS-like service. It gives us the ability to essentially begin trying to recreate or to create our infrastructure in the cloud. Instead of having virtual machines and hosts in our data center, we're going to leverage virtual machines and hosts in Microsoft's data center. So they provide now the ability to use common storage and Azure-based storage as your clustering and iSCSI endpoints. Once again, instead of you and I having to manage and maintain that storage physically or locally in our data center, now by using an Azure endpoint, that storage is managed up here by Microsoft. Advantages, well, there's a ton of them, and unfortunately we don't really have the time to go into it, but things like security of data, redundancy for data, the ability to scale out or to scale down based on the needs we have are going to be here. So now we've got a front-end cluster that's making sure that front-end services are available. We've got our storage secured in the Azure cloud should we choose to go that route. So from a functional standpoint, whether we go local storage, whether we go through a SAN-based storage like we initially discussed, or now whether we go through an Azure endpoint, those are all going to be things that are supported in that server 2016 environment. Talked a little about the fact that the witnesses, the drives, the external accounts can be Azure storage accounts as well. And again, we just kind of talk about some of those things, obviously, here at a very high level as well. So PowerShell, all right, not a whole lot we can add here. I think the most important aspect of this is the fact that PowerShell now has been extended to support all of the new functional enhancements and improvements from within the 2016 environment. If you're not a PowerShell person, certainly worth sitting with us and taking a 3-day PowerShell class at some point. We'll do a really good job of making sure that you've got everything you need in regards to getting familiar and working with PowerShell. If you are a PowerShell person, then just know that we've got extended commandlets and functionality that essentially stretch across that Server 2016 environment. So kind of at the very end, right, the last thing that we'll touch on here is the new component available for storage. I'm not going to go through all of the storage functionality, but we had mentioned just a moment ago that at any point, if we were going to be providing any sort of a clustered resource or access to data, then we have to make sure that the data is securely configured and ready. So again, I'll make this quick. Single server, right? And within that single server, single drive. So single server, single drive, and then within that drive, potentially we could go about, so one physical drive, we could partition it. So you have a partition here, and the partition would be a C drive, or right, the partition would be right E drive, whatever it might be. So as we started to scale this out a little bit, and we started to kind of take this to where we needed to enhance our storage, instead of going with a physical disk of sorts, then we've got the ability to start adding multiple drives. So now moving forward a little bit by adding multiple drives, and then we could take those multiple drives and we could combine those drives into a single logical. So you and I would know that there's drive 1, drive 2, drive 3, but from the operating system perspective, that could be viewed as one big C drive. Now the limitation now, and the thing that we started to see was that was really the only level that we had to start really separating or segmenting out how storage was allocated. So as we started to again move a little farther, now what we see is the ability to create what are called storage spaces. And your storage space takes it to the next level. Now, instead of going out and saying, hey, we're going to take this and we're going to combine 3 physical drives into one instance, we can then also now begin carving up additional instances within a storage space. So by being able to carve out additional instances within the storage space, we can take advantage of some of the traditional things that something like this gives us, which would be striping of data, right? Like a RAID 0 stripe where we're distributing the data across the 3 drives, which gives us, again, advantages on write performance. Or if we wanted to go in and go with RAID 5 where we had parity, which gave us fault tolerance, again, the problem is it's just one seat, and it's the underlying drives here that you're looking at. So now we can do, with storage spaces, we can go one more tier. With a storage space, we can do this same thing, except now I can slice this up, and I can say that is going to be a logical representation of F. And the F drive is going to be the drive that all of my VHDs for my virtual machines are going to be stored. And then we can take that same thing and create another, again, logical partition here within the storage space that might be treated as G, and we could say this is the spot where we're going to keep all of the data. So you still have the advantage of being able to, again, add multiple drives, extend the individual virtual spaces within, take advantage of things like striping, but we've given you one more tier as far as being able to isolate the data that's being distributed and stored. So again, there's a ton more to it. I mean, you can replicate instances, you can do real-time backups and snapshots of the data within. Again, just a really, really big upgrade to some of the things that we've seen in regards to being able to segment out the different units, logical units within. So that hopefully takes us or gives you a decent feel, and obviously it's a very high level overview of some of the technologies that Server 2016 really looks to enhance and improve. You've got all of the standard things that we've always had prior, Active Directory, DNS, DHCP, and you'll certainly see some incremental improvements there. But the big improvements really are in some of the more common things that we find ourselves working with these days. Virtualization, big steps up. Clustering and fault tolerance, big steps up. The ability to go back in and to manage storage and some of the technologies there, big steps up. So they've certainly made some dramatic improvements to those areas, and hopefully in doing what we did here for the 45 minutes or so we had together, gives you a feel for some of the things that they've added and some of the spots where they've improved. Like we talked about earlier at the beginning of our session, this obviously is just a way for us to say hello to you, a way for us to introduce ourselves and to give you a feel for, certainly not only some of the things we do, but for how we do them. We have a lot of different classes, and we have a lot of training that is Server 2016 specific. We try to do as fantastic a job as we can for you in going, to the nth level. Not only, taking the time to discuss, to describe, but also trying to add as much depth as we can with real world scenarios and things that we can bring to the table, in what we do. And whether it's a Server 2016 class, whether it's going to be a class for Azure and some of the Azure-based training we do, whether it's a class that deals with Microsoft core technologies like System Center, we certainly would appreciate the opportunity to help you out in any way that you might need some help with. Along with the training that we provide, every class will have for you a virtual environment that I had spun up here just to give you a feel. And within the virtual environment, we also will include for you very detailed steps and instructions. So, we're really proud of the training we do, but I'll tell you what, we're every bit as proud of the lab environment that we provide for you. We can guarantee no mistakes. We can guarantee no gotchas. And we also provide the labs for you for 6 months after you're done with the class. So we'll record things, we'll give you access to labs, we'll cover the content in as in-depth a manner as we can, and then we give you the ability to work in the environment and work with the product and provide follow-up for 6 months post. So I appreciate you coming in and taking some of your time. Obviously, I know that's valuable. I hope that the 45 minutes or so we had was interesting, informative, and maybe a little bit of fun. And we certainly look forward to y'all giving us a shot if you ever find yourself with any training needs. So I'll leave it there. Kind of open it up to David or Kelly, and everybody have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. If you guys have any questions, feel free to type them in now, and we will address those over audio. Just to reiterate what Jamie had said regarding our courses, if you are not familiar with New Horizons or our available course offerings, please log on to our website at newhorizons.com. You can do a zip code search there to find the center nearest you, and you can also see a full schedule and list and pricing on our available course offerings. Also wanted to remind you all that this session is being recorded. I will send you all a link to view the session recording later today. We also have a full schedule of webinars that are free for you to attend. So I highly recommend attending these. Visit our website at newhorizons.com. Click on the webinars link and you'll see a full schedule of upcoming sessions and how to register for them. You can also find our webinar archive library on that same site. So if you go to our website, newhorizons.com, click on the webinars link and you'll see a bunch of, we have over 50 past webinar recordings that you can access at any time. So please take advantage of that. It looks like we don't have any questions. So Jamie, I just want to thank you again for presenting on behalf of New Horizons.
You're welcome. Enjoyed it. And everybody have a great week.
Thank you so much. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day. That will now conclude today's webinar.